Section 1 of Alcatraz of the Starways. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cinda J. M. Alcatraz of the Starways by Henry Hasse and Albert DePina. Section 1. Venus was a world enslaved, and then, like an avenging angel, fanning the flames of raging revolt, came a warrior princess in whose mind lay dread knowledge, the knowledge of a weapon so terrible it had been used but once in the history of the universe. "Purple!" Mark Denning almost sobbed. "A purple jasmine!" Forgetting the sweat in his eyes and the insufferable heat about him, his clutching hand held up the mud-dripping globe the size of a baseball, iridescent in the Venusian night. The phosphorescent glow that bathed the endless swamp in ghastly green struck myriad shimmering rainbows from the dark sphere. "2 more of those and you're free, lower species." It was an ironic voice, with the resonant sweetness of a cello in its depths, that issued from the haze nearby. Frantically, Mark reached down into the tepid mud, where he had felt the swaying stems of jasmine lilies whip about his knees. Another globe met his hand. He tugged and twisted until it tore from the stem, but when he raised it to the surface, it was white. Immediately it began to shrink. It would continue until it became the size of a small marble, when it would either rot, as the majority did, or begin to crystallize into a priceless Venusian pearl. But that happened only with 1 in 10,000. It was different with the purple ones. They never failed to crystallize into a violet globe of unearthly beauty and incalculable value. Less than 100 of the purple had ever been found. They were so rare that any prisoner who harvested 3 was granted freedom. "Pretty," the cello voice taunted behind Mark. "In a few hours it'll be rotting and stinking to high heaven." "Cut it, Alado," Mark growled. He tossed the white jasmine into the basket he pushed before him across the mud. The purple one he placed carefully in his trouser pocket. He pushed on, searching the pungent-smelling mud that came up to his thighs. Suddenly the warm ooze rose to his waist and crept inexorably higher. For an instant Mark clawed at the mud. It was surging up to his armpits now as he floundered in the tenacious sinkhole. He shook his head to get the sweat out of his eyes and the numbness from his brain. He stopped thrashing about, for he knew that was futile. He threw back his head and gave a shout in which was more than a note of sheer terror. At least a dozen men were moving near him, waist deep in the Venusian mud. At his cry, they stopped and stared at him dully, fatalistically. They could easily have formed a chain and pulled him out, but none moved. They'd seen too many repetitions of this tragedy to care any more. It happened every day. A new man, a little careless, caught in one of the deadly sinkholes. It happened even to the veterans of this Venusian prison camp, sometimes deliberately, as they became weary of a hopeless existence. The mud was almost to Mark's chin now. Only his forearms and his blond head were visible. Hatred came into his eyes as he glared at the men about him, most of them earthmen like himself, who would not help him. Again he struggled, tried to hoist himself upward. "Don't struggle, you fool," came the resonant voice from behind him. "Be still. Every movement helps to sink you." Then, in an undertone, "No human was ever able to think clearly anyway." Mark smiled despite his predicament. Then he urged, "Hurry, Alado, hurry." Over the expanse of hellish green-lit muck, a tiny figure inched toward Mark, scarcely 5 feet in height. Alado's arms and legs were now outspread to distribute his weight over as much area as possible. The rescuing figure was like an imp from Hades, clad as it was in a tight-fitting garment of metallic blue, which even the clinging mud failed to dull, while membranous wings of a lighter hue began at its wrists, joined to the entire underarm and the sides of its body all the way to its feet, much as the wings of a bat. Swiftly it crawled and wriggled toward the Earthman, and without a word grasped him with both tiny hands by the arms. It braced itself on its wings and heaved. A few inches of Mark Denning emerged from the mud with a sucking sound. Again Alado made a prodigious effort, and again the Earthman came up from the mud a few more inches. The winged figure held him there while it gasped for breath. "Now, spread your arms on the mud and stiffen your neck, subspecies." The winged one laughed. Swiftly it cupped its seemingly fragile hands under Mark's chin and slowly but surely began to pull him back and out. Most of an hour went by before the Earthman's superb torso had emerged and he was able to help the rescuer. At last he was out of the sinkhole, panting, almost exhausted and half nude. He still found strength to feel at his trouser pocket and was gratified to find his purple Jasmian still there. It was now about half its original size and soon would cease its shrinkage and begin to crystallize. Mark gazed into the oval face panting next to his. The heavily fringed eyes were closed as it breathed in labored gasps, and the slender, fragile form shook now and then with nervous spasms. Mark never ceased to wonder at the beauty of the Venusians, nor at their absolute and maddening conviction that theirs was the only true intelligence in the universe. Now to these qualities Mark added that of indomitable courage as he gazed at Alado and marveled. "Well, Alado, thanks seems sort of a stupid word. In a case like this, I owe you my life. I don't know how I'll ever repay the debt." Mark's eyes roved over the weird scene, taking in the soulless, hopeless hulks that had once been men, and it suddenly occurred to him that he'd had enough of this hellish corner of Venus. He'd been here 2 months, and already he was unable to think clearly. He was becoming identified with the living death of the Venusian Prison Swamp. His mission apparently had failed. What he had come to learn remained a secret, and he was slowly becoming like these shells of men who prowled the ocean of mud, eventually to disappear beneath it. "No need to thank me, Middle Order. I would have missed our discussions had you gone." The Venusian grinned impishly. "What? I've been promoted? You must be ill to call me anything above a lower order or a subspecies." Mark smiled too, but seriously wondered what crime had condemned Alado to a prison reserved only for the most hardened and hopeless criminals, or for political prisoners whose existence was a threat to the Triplanetary League. "At times, you're almost intelligent," the Venusian replied placidly. "Any one of these other men would have struggled had they been in your place, and I would have been helpless." "Why didn't you use your brain?" Mark couldn't resist prodding the other. "And by flying above me, get to me quicker, instead of crawling all that distance." The winged figure laughed mirthlessly, and for an answer held up its arms. The azure membranes that were its wings hung in limp folds. "Useless, you see," he said quietly. "The tendons have been cut. Otherwise, I could fly up and out of this swamp, despite its 500-mile width." Mark could find no words to say. Since being assigned at his own request to this last grim haven of the damned by the Triplanetary Prison Bureau on a special mission, there had been moments when the horror of it all made him doubt the wisdom of maintaining such a ghastly place. He knew, of course, the tremendous deterrent influence its existence exerted, besides the important revenue derived from Venusian pearls. Still, it all seemed too inhuman. "You don't seem criminal, Earthman," the cello-like voice introduced on Mark's thoughts. "I fail to catch the typical vibrations of the killers and ravagers. Your crime, was it political?" "Why, yes," Mark assented hurriedly. It wouldn't do for this Venusian to suspect he was an operative. "To put it briefly, I am classified as too individualistic for the new order of controlled endeavor. also typed as irreconcilable, and you know what that means. Perfectly. The enigmatic smile hovering on the Venusian's lips faded slowly. I, too, am apolitical. My father was Bedrim, the liberator. All we of Venus asked was real independence instead of the mock freedom your Earth grants us. In reality, we are a vassal state with no voice but Earth. Bedrim? Mark exclaimed aghast. For more than a decade, that name had made history, engulfing 3 planets in a suicidal struggle that had ended in a stalemate. Bedrim was dead now, Mark knew, but in Venus, and even on Mars, the name was a glorious legend. It was only with the greatest effort and vigilance that Earth was able to enforce the peace. So this is what became of you, Mark said slowly, softly. The 3 worlds do not know. They still wonder. Then he caught himself and bit his lip. Yes, Alato murmured bitterly. The worlds do not know. I was to be given amnesty. I was so young, but your inner council decided that as long as I lived, I would be a rallying point for irreconcilables of Venus, and so I was hunted from planet to planet until, well, here I am, on my own world, but as far away from my people as if I was on Betelgeuse. Here I do not live. But surely there must be some way of convincing the council that you're harmless, and if that fails, well, of getting you out of here. Out of Paradim? Alato's smile had all the despairing bitterness of a soul damned for all eternity. All the tears and the anguish and the racking sorrow of the condemned since the world began seemed to be frozen for an instant in that smile. Look about you, Earthman. It was true. Mark had to acknowledge the psychological genius who devised the Venusian prison system. For 500 miles, the swamp paradigm extended in either direction, impassable, pitted with sinkholes into which a man would disappear without a trace. And beyond were the impenetrable jungles, alive with lurking carnova, lurking monsters of the night, red in tooth and claw. Only on the opposite hemisphere were the 2 larger and hospitable continents of Venus. Here, on this tiny continent, the prison ship came once a month to hover over the tiny islet in the middle of the swamp, the only spot of firm ground for untold miles. Here it dropped supplies and food and occasionally picked up the little heaps of fabulous Venusian pearls. There were no guards, and none were needed, for at night, when the awful humidity increased, the men worked or died. With night came the dreaded fog, lurid in the ghostly illumination of the igneous fatui, the phosphorescent radiance of this vast graveyard. And the idol died. Decomposition of the blood set in. Essential salts within their bodies were dissolved. Cellular activity ceased, and their bodies bloated. Not many, however, were idle. Escape? For years it had been thought a virtual impossibility. The very thought would have brought smiles to the grim faces of that august body, the Triplanetary Bureau of Prisons. And yet, a notorious killer who had been sent to this swamp only a year ago had recently been found dead out in space. A patrol ship had found the body floating a few thousand miles off Callisto, an atom blast hole drilled neatly through the forehead. There was not the slightest doubt that this was the same man. How had this criminal been able to escape the swamp and travel to Callisto, millions of miles away? It was a mystery, and above all, a challenge. Apparently, the Venus prison had ceased to be impregnable. And that was why Mark Denning, the prison bureau's leading investigator, was here. Guard your pearl, middle species. Alato's voice was ironic once more. Escape, and with it you may buy a pardon. Without a backward glance, the Venusian moved on with nightmare slowness through the swirling mists, pushing his basket into which the Josmian globes were loaded. Escape, Mark thought, following the Venusian. He did not need to escape. He could signal the prison ship to pick him up the next time it arrived. He wondered if he should. He'd been here 2 months, and they were an eternity that dwarfed any concept of hell. But he hadn't any clue to the mystery of the escaping convicts, and he could hardly return with a confession of failure. He looked ahead through the mists at the slender body of Alado in its tight-fitting sheath of metallic blue. I would miss Alado, Mark whispered to himself, and if he can stand it here, I should be able to. What are you mumbling about to yourself? Alado's mocking voice came back to him. That lowers you from the middle species to the subspecies again. He held up a Josmian globe against the greenish swamp glow. White, he said contemptuously, and threw it into the basket. Pushing through the muck with his tremendous strength, Mark cut the distance that separated them. You may have my purple one, Alado. I will not need it, and perhaps with it you might... If I were to gather 100 purple ones, I could not buy my release. The Venusian was staring at Mark peculiarly, as if wondering why he should have made that offer. Do you suppose, Earthman, any of the other men saw you find it? They would kill you for it, cheerfully. No, I think not. No one saw me bring it up but you. Then guard it. Alado eyed Mark's powerful frame critically. Guard it with your life, for you may have to fight for it soon. Telepathy? You've caught someone's thought vibrations? Mark asked in a whisper. He well knew that telepathy, although not commonly used, was an established fact among the Venusians. But Alado's long lashes rested against pallid cheeks, veiling eyes that were abrim with something Mark could not understand. No, the winged one said at last. It wasn't a thought vibration. Not that clear. Perhaps a vibration of evil? Be alert, Earthman. I can say no more. All right. Thanks, Alado. But inwardly, Mark cursed the inherent Venusian mania for ultra-reserve, for making a mystery of even the most commonplace affairs. Let's head for the island. It's almost dawn. Above, the cloud cap was prismatic with color as the sun tried feebly to penetrate the grayness, and then gave up the attempt, as if it had tried many times before and failed. Slowly, the vast swamp's contours came into view, with their small island a faint green line against the horizon's rim, and, as the grayish dawn light increased, suffusing the grim morass, Mark and Alado made their slow way toward it. End of section 1.